Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Good to be back at the San Francisco Veg Fest. And I have been asked to talk to you guys about the health benefits of plant-based eating. And I've been asked to do that in a half an hour, which would be the equivalent of trying to get Trump in a spandex suit. That is obviously a topic that can cover hours and hours and hours, but we're going to try to do as much as we can in a half an hour. So let's get started. Can we take the lights down even a little further? Because I want these slides to pop if they can. All right. So,
You want the lights down a little bit?
Yeah, please. So again, we're going to talk about transitioning from the standard American diet to food that is good for the body and soul. And I always start my lectures off with a quote from God's Word. This is from the book of Genesis. God told Adam and Eve, "You shall eat the plants of the field." It was good advice then, and it's still good advice today. So, when you actually look at the health profile of Americans, you realize that the largest and most destructive epidemic of addiction in our country is not due to drugs, it's not due to alcohol, it's not due to meth or heroin. It's actually our addiction to unhealthy foods. The impact of our dysfunctional eating habits is reflected in the spiraling rates of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, depression, cancer, stroke, and a host of other chronic ailments, including dementias, which is starting to go off the chart. It has been estimated that the number of Americans diagnosed with diabetes has increased by over 80% in the last 10 to 15 years alone. And again, this avalanche of diabetes and chronic disease has affected people of all races and is fueled by the corruption and homogenization of American eating habits. And what do I mean by that? Well, it used to be that you went to the gas station to get gas. Now you can go to the gas station and get a hot dog that's older than you are. You can't get into Walmart without walking through McDonald's. And so these fast food corporations have gone out of their way to place these unhealthy foods within easy reach of everyone, and it's having a terrible impact not only on the health of us as adults, but also on our children, because we have spiraling rates of pediatric obesity that is also fueling an epidemic of type 2 diabetes in very young children. And again, we've seen the proliferation of fast food restaurants in poor neighborhoods. You can't get through an inner city neighborhood without passing McDonald's, Burger King's, Popeyes, Wendy's, and so forth. And they put these unhealthy foods within easy reach of everyone and couple them with marketing campaigns that encourage us to continually overeat just for the hell of it. And again, the damaging and destructive effects of these chronic diseases are amplified in communities of color because they reach disproportionate levels in these communities, and they have a devastating impact on the health profile of individuals within the community. So, for instance, when you look at complications rates, say, for diabetes, it turns out that an African American who develops diabetes is 240 times more likely to end up with a limb amputation than a Caucasian American, and over 100 times more likely to end up on dialysis or blind from retinal damage. And then when you look at the economic impact of these diseases, again, within these communities, it frequently happens that these diseases strike the primary wage earner in the family. And so whereas a family might have been trying to pull themselves out of a situation of poverty and get to a better neighborhood with better schools, suddenly they find themselves plunged right back into economic despair because now all of the family's resources have to go into buying medications and doctor's visits and so forth. And so it's just the impact cannot be overstated. And I just wanted to show you guys this because, as humans, we have a very short cultural and generational memory of what we have been doing and how we've been eating. And I think most people kind of assume that within the United States, we have always eaten, meat 3 times a day, had, hamburgers and, hot dogs and fried chicken and all this stuff and within easy reach. But that is really not true. Prior to World War II, the majority of people within the United States had a largely plant-based diet, not by choice, but by the simple fact that nobody could afford to eat meat all day, every day. Furthermore, we did not have industrial levels of meat production. Most animals were raised on small family farms, and as a result, you had much less meat available. Plus, anybody spend time with their grandparents? What do they call the refrigerator? Icebox. Why do they call it that? Because it used to be that there were no refrigerators, that they actually tried to keep things fresh in a box that had a big block of ice at the bottom of it. And when you have an ice box, you can't afford to have tons and tons of meat in that thing because it will rot. You also can't afford to have lots of milk and dairy because it will spoil. That's why there used to be milkmen bringing fresh milk every day. And so when you look at what used to kill people, say in the late 1800s versus the late 1900s, what you see is that cancer and heart disease, cancer is in blue, heart disease is in magenta, accounting for a very small proportion of deaths prior to the 20th century. Most people died from things like infections, respiratory illnesses, which were like TB, pneumonia, and accidents. But as we moved into the latter part of the 20th century, and particularly post-World War II, when, actually a couple things happened. Right around the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his projects to get people back to work built a lot of dams and electrified the nation. And so whereas people who previously didn't have indoor electricity suddenly had electricity. And then because of all the technological advancements that's in and around World War II, suddenly post-World War world, we were able to get refrigerators, washing machines, and all these things to everyone. And then that's when people began to be able to keep animal foods in their homes 24/7 and keep it from spoiling and keep it fresh. Then we unfortunately invented the egregious practice of factory farming, which suddenly made animal tissue available in large amounts to people again at will. And as a result, we are seeing a devastating impact on our health. Anybody in here over 50 years of age? Okay, cool. What are you supposed to have done at age 50? Colonoscopy. And that's because it used to be that people didn't get colon cancer until they were over 50. We're now seeing colon cancers hit people in their 20s and 30s because they are eating so much more meat than our parents and grandparents used to eat. And we're also seeing a greater increase in diabetes, heart disease, dementia, all of these lifestyle-related diseases. So I'm telling you, we're going to pay a fearful price for the way that we have chosen to eat. So let's briefly look at heart disease. Heart disease is the #1 killer of both men and women in not only the United States, but all Western countries. Every year, about 3/4 people have a heart attack, and roughly close to half of them will actually die from that initial heart attack. Now, because there are a lot of people who say, well, you know, if I get a heart attack, I'm just going to go to the hospital and have them give me a bypass or put a stent in. Well, actually, half the people who have heart attacks never even make it to the hospital. They're dead before they get there. But the other thing that you should realize is that neither bypass, coronary artery bypass, nor the placement of stents has ever been shown to increase lifespan or decrease the risk of having another heart attack. Now that kind of seems like, wait, whoa. What do you mean? Because if they go and do a bypass, didn't they fix my heart? No, they didn't. All they did was route your blood vessels around the blockage, but the underlying disease that caused that blockage is still going on. And if you don't change the underlying mechanism causing the disease, you are still as likely to die from heart disease and have another heart attack as anybody else. You've got to stop the behaviors that create the disease. And epidemiology studies show that populations consuming plant-based diets are at much lower risk for developing heart disease. Healthy plant-based diets benefit our hearts by being low in total and saturated fat, especially if you're not eating coconut oil, but relatively high in heart-healthy fats like mono and polyunsaturated oils. They're also high in fiber, plant proteins, and antioxidants, contain no cholesterol if you're vegan, and all of these things will help reduce your risk of developing heart disease. Vegetarian vegans typically have cardiovascular risk profiles that are well below those of omnivorous populations. They live longer, have lower weight, lower blood pressure, lower levels of homocysteine, which can damage your blood vessels, and cholesterol levels that can be 100 to 150 points below individuals who eat meat. This comes from the data on Seventh-day Adventists and from the Adventist Health Study. And what this study shows is that Seventh-day Adventist men and women who are plant-based have lower rates of heart disease at every age that they have looked at than the general population. And again, this comes from being plant-based. How many of you guys know what the blue zone is? All right, for those of you who don't know, blue zones are the areas around the globe where people live the longest and have the lowest risk of developing chronic diseases and dementia. What is the only blue zone that is in the United States? Loma Linda. Oh, you guys are good. And what's special about Loma Linda? And what's special about them? Half of them are plant-based, absolutely. Seventh-day Adventist men live an average of 9.5 years longer. Seventh-day Adventist plant-based men live an average of 9.5 years longer than the average population. And Seventh-day Adventist plant-based women live about 6.6 years longer on average. And does that mean that being plant-based is less beneficial for women than it is for men? No, it's just that, ladies, you guys outlive us already, so there's just less room for improvement. All right, well, let's look at high blood pressure. Affects 1 in 4 Americans. I'm a bit of a Luddite. You know, if I was Amish, I'd be in a horse and buggy. I'm used to doing things by hand. All right. It's often called the silent killer because most people don't realize they have it, but it's still doing damage to your heart and your blood vessels, even though you don't realize you have it. Increases your risk for heart disease, peripheral vascular disease, and stroke. Risk factors for high blood pressure include being overweight, obviously a family history, drinking too much alcohol, smoking, taking in too much sodium, a diet that's high in high fructose corn syrup, and a lack of regular exercise, but very importantly, diets that are high in animal protein and animal fat, and that's probably the major risk factor, assuming you don't smoke and drink like, you know, the proverbial fish. Now, let me just ask a couple questions here. How many of you have ever thought about this term, high fructose corn syrup? You thought about it, but we've all eaten corn on the cob, right? Has anybody in here ever wrung syrup from a cob of corn? So if not, how the heck do you end up with something called corn syrup and by extension high fructose corn syrup? Both corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup are artificially made products. What these food manufacturers do is they take corn starch, which, again, if you know your biochemistry, starch is just glucose molecules that are joined together in long chains. They break up those glucose molecules into individual sugar molecules, add some water, and now you have corn syrup. And then when they want to make high fructose corn syrup, they put it through a chemical process that rearranges a large percentage of the glucose molecules into fructose molecules. Why do they do that?
It affects you faster.
Uh-huh.
It affects you faster. So it skips like the regular.
Well, yeah, okay, but that's really not the reason they do it. Anybody know? Okay, farm subsidies help them do it, but again, that's not the reason that they do it. Okay, let me just tell you. Table sugar is sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide, meaning it's two sugar molecules joined together. It's one glucose, one connected to one fructose molecule. Turns out that fructose by itself is perceived by our taste buds as being many times sweeter than actual sucrose. And it's a beautiful system because that means you can eat a piece of fruit that has a small amount of fructose in it and it tastes very sweet, but you're not getting a huge sugar load. Well, somebody got the bright idea. They said, well, if fructose is perceived as being many times sweeter than actual sucrose, if we can get our hands on a lot of fructose, we can use half as much sugar, which means that our products will weigh much less, which means it will cost much less to ship them. And since we're using less sugar, we don't have to put as much money into making our soda pop and ketchup and whatever else we're putting this stuff in. You understand my point? So by using fructose, they can use a lot less sugar, meaning that they don't have to spend as much money on sugar. And then when they get ready to ship their products around the country, it costs them a lot less because these products actually weigh less because there's less sugar in them. The problem is that our bodies are not designed to handle huge amounts of fructose. And when you take in huge amounts of fructose, not only does it increase your risk for high blood pressure, it also increases your risk for gout and the metabolic syndrome. So this is a study that was a crossover study, looked at the impact of a plant-based diet on blood pressure. So in blue, you have the control group. And so both for period 1 and period 2, they stayed on their same diet where they're just kind of eating meat and whatever else they're eating. Now, you can see that there was this unexplained dip in blood pressure kind of halfway through period 2, but ultimately at the beginning of period 1 and the end of period 2, the people in the control group essentially had the same blood pressure. All right, well, what happened with group 2? Group 2 was put on a plant-based diet in period 1, and look what happened to their blood pressure. It plummeted, stayed down until they started eating meat again, then it went right back up. Group 3 stayed on the meat-eating diet in period 1, but once they switched to a plant-based diet, their blood pressure plummeted. Again, very, very convincing evidence that a plant-based diet will lower your blood pressure. The REGARD study, and REGARD stands for Reasons for Geographic and Racial Differences in Stroke, examined the relationship between diet and stroke in over 30,000 black and white Americans aged 45 years or older. It showed that most of the increased stroke risks that we find in the African American community can be explained by differences in diet. The REGARD study showed that the so-called Southern diet style, which featured heavy consumption of fried foods, organ meats, processed meats, full-fat milk, and sugar-sweetened drinks, while limiting the intake of fruits, salads, whole grains, and other plant foods, increased stroke risk by a whopping 63%. Now, they had a variant that they called the plant-based diet pattern. I want you guys to understand that these were not vegans. They weren't even vegetarians. These were simply people who ate proportionately more plant foods. But even that little change caused them to have a reduced stroke risk by up to 20%. So obviously, if they had become completely plant-based, it would have been reduced by even more. And again, I try to remind people all the time, all food is simply made up of chemicals that we can extract energy from. Some of these chemicals are good, some of them are bad. We obviously want to maximize the good ones and leave the bad ones alone. What are the bad ones? Anything that comes from an animal. All right, looking at cancer deaths. In the United States, leading cause of cancer death for men and women is lung. Then you move to the hormone-related cancers. So in men, second leading cause of cancer deaths, prostate cancer. In women, it's breast cancer. But then third for both groups is, again, a diet-related cancer that is colorectal cancer. But I also want to, let me be very clear, that both prostate and breast cancer are also diet-related. And then number 4, which is important to pay attention to, is pancreatic cancer. And the reason that's important is because pancreatic cancer is the fastest increasing type of cancer in the United States. And by 2020, is projected to become the second leading cause of cancer death for all Americans. And we all know that, sadly, Aretha Franklin recently passed away. She died from pancreatic cancer. So let's look at breast cancer and fat intake. When you look at countries where they have a very low fat, a low animal food diet versus those at the top of the graph that have a very animal food centered diet, you see that breast cancer risk is very low where people eat very low amounts of fat. But if you take a woman who lives in Japan and normally has a very low fat diet and she migrates to the United States and starts eating like the rest, like most Americans do, I'm not gonna say the rest of us because I don't eat that way, her cancer risk skyrockets and eventually reaches the level of the general population. And actually, in actual fact, it actually exceeds the rate for the general population. And you see the same thing when you look at breast cancer as a function of animal food intake. Again, where people have a more plant-based diet, they have very low rates of breast cancer, but as you go up the chain and people start eating more and more animal food, the incidence of breast cancer skyrockets. And again, you see the same thing with migration. When women migrate from a country where they have a very low rate and a more plant-based diet to one where they have a diet that is centered around animal foods and they start adopting that diet, their breast cancer rate skyrockets and eventually reaches that of the general population. Looking at red meat and colon cancer risk. If you, using those people who never or rarely ever eat red meat as a baseline, men that eat red meat more than 5 times a week have you can say a 360% increase in their cancer risk. For women who eat red meat on a daily basis, they have a 250% increase in their cancer risk. And again, when you look at colon cancer incidence versus daily meat consumption in countries where there's a very low meat intake, very low rates of colon cancer, in places like the US, New Zealand, Canada, where we eat meat every day, we have a very high rate of colon cancer. Breast, prostate, pancreatic, and colon cancers have all been shown to be increased by diets that are high in fat and animal protein, and at the same time that are low in grains, vegetables, and fruit. The diets that are high in saturated and trans fat and red meat and other types of animal protein are especially problematic. These cancers do strike African Americans to a disproportionate degree and with greater lethality. 5-year breast cancer survival rates for African American women are 69% compared to 84% for Caucasian women. And African American men have a 60% higher incidence rate for prostate cancer than Caucasian men. And once we, as African American men, are diagnosed with prostate cancer, we are more than twice as likely to die from it relative to our Caucasian counterparts. What is the #1 risk factor for prostate cancer? Habitual consumption of dairy foods, as well as eggs and animal tissue. Pancreatic cancer incidence rates for 2002 to 2004 were 27% and 40% higher in African American men and women, respectively, compared to Hispanic and white men and women, and the mortality rates were correspondingly higher, 29 and 38% higher. So again, given its lethality with cancers, with heart disease, an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. So I gotta ask you, you got milk? Because if you do, you got problems. And to really understand why cow's milk and mammalian milk in general is a problem, all you have to do is think about what mammalian milk is designed to do. Mammal milk is a biological fluid secreted by the female of the species once she is given birth that is designed to do what? To take a baby.
It's running.
Huh? Oh, okay. No, that's okay. It's designed to take a baby and make it grow from an infant to an adult. So it's designed to stimulate growth. But what else is it designed to do? Infant mammals have immature immune systems, right? So mother's milk is also designed to stimulate immune function. Well, what happens in an adult human who's already grown, fully grown, and you're in a steady state, you start ingesting something that's stimulating your cells to grow and divide. You're not going to get any taller. You may get a bit wider. But the other thing that's going to happen is it's going to cause tumor formation in your body. And that can be anywhere along that spectrum from benign to cancerous tumors. And that's why habitual consumption of dairy foods are associated with higher rates of cancer. The only way dairy foods can be considered remotely healthy is by modifying them to reduce their high fat and lactose content. And now, have you guys seen these new commercials where they talk about, we've taken the problematic protein out of dairy? It's this A2 milk. I'm just like, how sick is this crap? You guys are like taking protein out, you're taking fat out, you're trying to take the lactose out. Just leave the crap alone. It's not healthy. Habitual consumption of cow's milk has been linked to an increased risk of developing a variety of cancers, including breast, uterus, ovary, prostate, and testes. Research by Dr. Colin Campbell showed that casein is a very potent cancer promoter, and it can markedly enhance the development of liver cancer in children when they're exposed to something like aflatoxin. Now, how many of you have seen stuff on the internet about phytoestrogens? Oh, that's a problem. You gotta avoid soy because it's full of phytoestrogens, right? If you're a guy and you eat soy, you're gonna end up wearing a bra. And if you're a woman and you eat soy, you're gonna end up, with breast cancer, right? And you guys have seen this nonsense, right? Well, number one, it's nonsense, okay? Oh, and let me just do my little PSA. I want you guys to assume that I am Sarah Sanders and everything I'm telling you is a lie, okay? Go home and research this for yourself, because the more you learn, the more you will be convinced that everything I'm telling you is the God's honest truth and that you gotta avoid animal foods if you want to be healthy. How do we get milk from cows? Do we just walk up to a cow and say, please give me some milk? What do we have to do to them to have them give us milk? We got to get them pregnant. So that means that their body is full of what? Hormones, estrogen. So don't you think it's like ludicrous to be worried about plant estrogens when you're down here swilling actual estrogen? I mean, how retarded can you be? And a word about phytoestrogens. There are two estrogen receptors, estrogen 1, estrogen 2. Estrogen 1 is a receptor that responds to normal estrogen, gives women, nice hips, breasts, and all the secondary sex characteristics that we associate with being female. Turns out phytoestrogens will bind to estrogen receptor 1, but they don't activate it. So in essence, they block it. So they actually help lower total estrogenic stimulation in a woman's body, and that's why studies have shown consistently that phytoestrogens and soy products in particular lower the risk for hormone-related cancers, particularly breast cancer. But they do something else that's really cool. You've all heard about how estrogen can help strengthen your bones, right? That's mediated through estrogen receptor 2. Turns out phytoestrogens do bind to estrogen receptor 2, and they do activate it, and that's the one you need for good, strong bones. So eat your plant foods, eat your soy, stop paying attention to the nonsense on the internet. And by the way, China, the most populous nation on earth, 1.7 billion people, they eat a lot of soy, none of the men are wearing bras, and clearly they have no problem getting busy. So. Milk consumption, uterine cancer, again, we've gotten familiar with this graph. The more you ingest, the higher your risk for uterine cancer. Again, milk and breast cancer risk. Again, the more milk and dairy foods a woman consumes, the higher her risk of breast cancer. Recent study out of the UK showed that women who habitually consume dairy foods have a 64% higher risk of developing breast cancer than women who don't. Dairy and prostate cancer research has consistently shown that habitual use of milk and other dairy products increases the risk for prostate cancer. 12 or 14 case control studies, 7 or 9 cohort studies have shown a positive association between dairy foods and prostate cancer. And it's also shown that meat, eggs, fish also increase prostate cancer risk in a dose-dependent fashion, meaning the more you eat, the higher your risk. So no, fish is not healthy. It's animal tissue, and we should not be ingesting it. Plus, the fish would appreciate it if we'd leave them alone. And some people will say, well, wait, no, it's the fat. It's the fat in the milk that's the problem. No, it's not. This is skim milk, and you can see, again, all the fat's been taken out, but you drink it, you're gonna get prostate cancer. So, well, what's the number one reason that we're told that we should drink and eat dairy foods? It's because supposedly, it's going to build strong bones, because we don't want to end up like these birds here, right? Sort of slithering around the ground like an amoeba. Well, turns out that dairy calcium has never been shown to strengthen bones or protect against osteoporosis. In fact, the Harvard Nurses Health Study showed that the women who drank the most milk had the highest risk of hip fracture, and there is abundant calcium in green leafy plants. I tell people cows don't drink milk, but there's plenty of calcium in their milk. Where do they get it from? The green stuff that they eat. If you take a 6-foot man, remove all the flesh and muscle and tissue from his skeleton and weigh his bones will weigh, this entire skeleton weighs about 25 pounds. And it takes that 6-foot man, 18 to 20 years to actually reach peak bone mineral density. A full-grown moose, the set of antlers on a full-grown moose weighs 85 pounds. And that moose grows those antlers in 3 months eating nothing but green plants. There's plenty of calcium in plant foods. Leave the dairy alone. So again, hip fracture, milk consumption. Countries that drink the most milk have the highest rates of osteoporosis and hip fracture. This is looking at animal protein intake. Why is animal protein important? Because animal protein causes you to lose calcium in your urine. That calcium is then mobilized from your skeleton. Over a lifetime, you'll end up basically peeing out your calcium. And I know I'm moving fast, but it's like I feel the Grim Reaper breathing down my neck. Lactose intolerance. Let me just say, I'm very proud of this picture, because I actually created this ad. And the idea was, And it comes from the fact that the majority of people of color in the United States are lactose intolerant. So the whole point is, and I came up with this because I got pissed off because the dairy industry was using Venus and Serena Williams to advertise milk consumption and having them wear milk protectors. I'm like, please, if they drank that milk, they would be in the bathroom doubled over. I know because I can tell you about my own history. So symptoms of lactose intolerance: diarrhea, abdominal cramps, gas, bloating, abdominal pain. Majority of beings worldwide, 65% of humans are lactose intolerant, or, well, I'm just going to use that as a convenience term. Within the United States, 95% of Asians, 73% of African Americans, 70% of Native Americans, and 53% of Hispanics are intolerant of lactose versus only about 30 to 33% of Caucasian Americans. When you look at milk and autoimmune disease, there's a definite link. And again, remember I said milk is designed to stimulate immune function. Well, if your immune system is already normal and functioning properly, you don't want to overstimulate it. It's like going to a police department and telling the police, hey, go out and rustle up some business. They're going to start beating people over the head and arresting people for no reason. Well, when you start overstimulating your immune system, it starts attacking your own tissues. And that's why there's been a definite link shown between the consumption of dairy foods and diseases like type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, but also rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and even lupus. So this looks at type 1 diabetes and milk consumption. Again, the countries that consume the most milk have the highest rates of type 1 diabetes, and there's a very good and delineated mechanism for that, but I don't have time to go into it. But it has to do with the proteins in the cow's milk stimulating the immune system to attack the pancreas. When you look at milk consumption and multiple sclerosis, again, in places where they consume the most milk, they have the highest rates of MS. All right, hopefully this video will play.
In previous videos, we've had a look at the link between the consumption of dairy products and cancer, and in particular, ovarian, liver, prostate, and colon cancer. We've also seen the possible relationship between dairy and autoimmune diseases, dairy, asthma and rheumatoid arthritis, and the possible link between milk and multiple sclerosis, to name just a few. But what else are we not being told about when it comes to the consumption of dairy products and our health? Let's hear now from Dr. Michael Greger of nutritionfacts.org as he reveals some more disturbing truths about dairy.
The number one source of calcium in the American diet is dairy products. The number one source of artery-clogging saturated fat, however, in the American diet is not beef, it's dairy products. Number one allergen in the food supply as well. So yes, cow's milk represents a substantial source of calcium, but it all depends on what baggage you want with your calcium. The kind of bonus you get with dairy is the saturated butterfat and lactose and cholesterol and antibiotics, pesticides, pus, and manure. And if you're skeptical, when scientists test pasteurization protocols, they actually have to take the manure into account. Heat and activation of milk contaminated with infected feces. To account for what happens naturally in the dairy industry, high concentrations of feces from infected cows were used to contaminate milk just to test their pasteurization protocols. There was even a pus study last year in the Journal of Dairy Science, kind of to ask the age-old question, can you taste the pus? Well, the United States has the highest allowable pus cell concentration in the world, can allow 300 million pus cells per tall frosty glass. Now, the industry, however, has always argued that it doesn't matter how infected and inflamed the udders of dairy cows are because of pasteurization, right? It's cooked pus, so there's no food safety risk. But what this study did was, well, can you taste the difference? That is important to industry. And so they made 2 vats of cheese, one with U.S. milk and one conforming to the more stringent European standards. And the now with less pus cheese evidently tasted significantly better, at least according to this study. And speaking of pus, yes, zits. New Harvard study found so much significantly more acne in milk drinkers that it led a top dermatology journal to editorialize for what they call a no dairy diet, reducing dairy for anyone with acne to 0 because of the hormone content in milk. There's no such thing as hormone-free, milk, meat, or eggs. All animals produce testosterone, estrogen, and those steroids are deposited in their flesh and fluids. Harvard nurses studied those eating dairy doubled their risk of having a heart attack. Or feed your kid lots of dairy and triple their risk of colorectal cancer 65 years later. So these were children that were fed dairy as kids 65 years later had triple the colorectal cancer risk compared to those that didn't have dairy as children. More dairy, more prostate cancer. More dairy, more testicular cancer. More dairy, more Parkinson's disease. Every single study ever done on Parkinson's and dairy consumption found increased risk of Parkinson's for those eating dairy.
Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below and subscribe for more upcoming videos.
Just a few quick words about diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance. 95% of the people in the United States with diabetes have type 2 diabetes. Factors that increase insulin resistance and increase your risk for developing diabetes are, of course, being overweight, having a high-fat, low-fiber diet, eating a lot of animal protein and dairy foods, eating a lot of processed carbs, lack of exercise. Actually, smoking increases insulin resistance. And things that do the opposite, and that is make your body more sensitive to insulin and reverse insulin resistance are having a high-fiber, low-fat, plant-based diet that is comprised of whole plant foods. So, looking at dietary fat, these three curves were generated in one individual based on differences in fat intake. So, the red diet was the, notice that all the diets have the same number of calories, and they also have the same amount of protein. The only thing that differs from diet to diet is the amount of calories from fat versus the amount of calories from carbohydrate. And you can see that in the high-fat, low-carb diet, the blood sugar profile is off the chart. It interferes with the ability of insulin to do its job, and as a result, these people have very high blood sugar levels. When you modify that and decrease the amount of fat, and increase the amount of carbohydrate, you get the yellow line, which is a better line. But the best line of all is from the high-carb, low-fat diet. Low-carb diets will kill you. There's a recent article in the journal Lancet that showed that people who eat low-carb diets are at increased risk for all-cause mortality. Dietary fiber is critically important for us. It only comes from plants. There are two types of many varieties of fiber. There's water-soluble fiber, and even within that category, there are gums, pectins. They protect you against heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, and colitis. How do you know if something has a lot of water-soluble fiber in it? What's the poster child for water-soluble fiber? Huh? There's one even better than oats. Okra. You notice how slimy okra is? That's all water-soluble fiber, and it's good for you. But all plants have some amount of water-soluble fiber. Some have more than others. But oats are another excellent source. Then there's your water-insoluble fiber. These are the celluloses, hemicelluloses, protect you against colon cancer, constipation, diverticulosis, and hemorrhoids. When you look at fiber and blood sugar control, now in this diet, the differences in fiber intake was 3 grams of fiber versus 20 grams of fiber. If you are plant-based, you're getting somewhere between 80 to 100 grams of fiber or more per day. But just increasing the amount of fiber by 20 grams, you can see that you get much better blood sugar profiles than when these people were eating the almost no fiber diet. Looking at the relative prevalence of diabetes in vegetarians, people who are non-vegetarian have much higher risk. In women, it's 40% higher. In men, it's 80% higher. This study looked at the effect of a high carbohydrate, low fat diet on insulin use in men with type 2 diabetes. At baseline, you had 20 people on insulin. Their mean dose was 26 units per day. After 16 days on a high carb, low fat diet, half of them were able to come off insulin altogether, and even those who were still on the insulin had reduced their insulin dose by more than half. And that was only 16 days. If they stayed on it for 8 weeks, they'd probably be completely cured. Looking at low-fat diet plus intensive exercise at baseline, you had 197 people who were on oral medications. After 26 days of a low-fat diet with exercise, 2/3 of them no longer needed to take diabetes medicines. So just let me wrap up by looking at the issue of dementia, because one of the most frightening aspects of aging is the possibility that we can develop some form of dementia and lose our sense of who we are and our hold on those we love. Projections are that as our population ages, the prevalence of all types of dementias are going to increase, and that includes Alzheimer's disease, and it's going to obviously have a major detrimental impact on our healthcare system, to say nothing of the impact on families. Alzheimer's disease cases are projected to triple by the year 2050. The risk of developing Alzheimer's is increased by diets that are high in meat, dairy, and fat. Dietary habits can significantly affect and potentially reduce the risk of developing all types of dementia, and that includes alcohol-related dementia, which you should stop drinking. This is a look around the world at the places where they eat the most meat. The darker the color, the more meat they eat. Why is that important? Because when you look at the incidence of Alzheimer's disease, you see it's related to diet. Where people eat a lot of meat, they have very high rates of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Where people have plant-based diets, but they have very low rates of dementia. So again, it correlates, dementia and Alzheimer's correlates with per capita consumption of meat and animal foods. You can reduce your risk by reducing your intake of animal foods. Other factors are having diabetes, alcohol use, being overweight, but again, these are also related to diet and lifestyle. Genetics and family history do play a role. However, the way I want you to think about your genetic risk for developing chronic disease is as follows. Having lungs makes us all genetically susceptible to drowning, but only if we get into water over our heads. So just because you have a family predisposition, if you stay out of that high-risk environment, in other words, if you stay away from the diet that promotes the development of these diseases, you're unlikely to develop the disease itself. Research suggests that Alzheimer's risk can be reduced by decreasing intake of saturated trans fat, animal protein, alcohol, maintaining a healthy weight, and not smoking. Fruits, vegetables, and fruit and vegetable juices, antioxidants, vitamin C and E, exercise, and plant-based omega-3 fatty acids have all been shown to protect against this disease. And this is just a look at some of the fruits and veggies that alter performance and memory in aging individuals. So now I have to say, tell you in the interest of being completely transparent, this study was done in lab animals. They took some elderly rats who couldn't remember their way through a maze and who had trouble walking. They fed them spinach, strawberries, cranberries, black currants, purple grape juice, plum juice, blueberries, and walnuts, and they could suddenly find their way back through the maze. They also didn't have the problems walking when they ate similar foods. And you can see walnuts make both lists. There's a reason why walnuts look like little brains. They're good for your brain. All right. All right. I'm going to have to stop with this slide because I've gotten the wrap it up sign, and the next step is they come out with a shepherd's rod and pull me off the stage. So let me just leave you with this. Vegetarian, vegan diets are associated with less heart disease, a greater than 50% reduction in all-cause mortality, cause cancer mortality, lower blood pressure, less osteoporosis, both before and after menopause, reduced risk of stroke, less obesity, less chronic disease, decreased incidence of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, greater longevity, lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, greater fertility actually, and lower risk for erectile dysfunction. I've heard from women who have plant-based boyfriends that we do it better. Better immune system function, increased level of energy and functional capacity, higher level of antioxidants, and a greater sense of well-being, reduced risk of depression and anxiety disorders, and of course, a reduced impact on the planet. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you guys for being here.